Today's scripture comes from 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 through to 18. Finally, all of you, be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called, so that you may inherit a blessing. For whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil and do good. They must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good? But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened. But in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. For it is better, if it is God's will, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Hey, you may be seated, everyone. Hey, good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, to Hope. My name is Drew. I'm one of the pastors here. We've actually been in this message series called Emotionally Healthy Mission. Now, I recognize that each of those words, for some of you, maybe you're new to church, maybe this religion thing is something that you're just doing because someone invited you and you thought you might amuse them or whatever, and you're wondering, what are we talking about when we talk about these themes of emotionally healthy and mission? Well, first of all, if you've been part of our church for a while, or if you know anyone that's part of our church, one of the things that we regularly talk about is this theme of emotionally healthy discipleship. Now, what discipleship means is for us is that we are a people who hopefully are being discipled by Jesus. We want to follow the way of Jesus. This is why Jesus is central to our faith. And emotionally healthy discipleship is just simply one pathway by which we're saying, hey, we want to follow Jesus in really real and authentic ways. Now, what do we mean when we talk about emotional health, though? This is what we mean. It's that emotional health and spiritual maturity are inseparable. In other words, it's impossible to be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature. In other words, it doesn't matter if I've got a Master of Divinity and I've got a graduate degree in Bible and theology and whatever else it might be. At the end of the day, I might read the scriptures regularly. I might be someone who have all sorts of titles in front of my name. But at the end of the day, I've got an anger issue. And the way that my anger manifests and it's taken out on people whenever I get offended or hurt, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how many titles or how many degrees I have. At the end of the day, I'm really not that spiritually mature. Or I could be someone who preaches wonderful sermons, and yet I'm super defensive, or when I get anxious and afraid, I run to my addiction of choice. And as a result, I have this private life that I cultivate that no one else knows about. But what happens when I go to my anxiety is I act out in these various different ways. Now, basically what this thesis is saying then is that when it comes down to spiritual maturity, following in the way of Jesus is not simply about kind of a surface spirituality, changing behaviors and practices. It actually gets deep into the guts of our lives. Now, not only that, we talk about how emotional health and a slowed down spirituality or a contemplative spirituality is necessary for a revolution in our lives. In other words, there's enough space in my life, enough of a prayer life that I have, a way in which I am not simply go, doing things at the expense of my own soul. And so we often use this image as the image of an iceberg. An iceberg, of course, 10% of an iceberg is above the surface. This is what people can see. And yet there's this 90% that's down in the depths of the sea of an iceberg. And what we're trying to say here is what emotionally healthy discipleship is, and what we're encouraging you and me and all of us to be on the journey of following Jesus. It's more than simply just changing that 10%, putting on a smiley face, putting on our Sunday best, and acting a certain way on a Sunday. It's actually getting into the guts of our lives. It's actually this invitation to get into the 90%, to allow God into the areas of my own defensiveness, into the areas of my anger, into the areas of my woundedness, into the areas of my workaholism, God help me, right? There's all these ways in which God is inviting us. And when we talk about emotional healthy deception, we're talking about getting into this 90%. Now, at the same time, our tradition is also about mission, that we're to be a people with our words and with our deeds, that hopefully we care about the marginalized, that we're preaching the good news of freedom that's found in Jesus. And that's where these three words come together, emotionally healthy mission. Now, another way that we're gonna put it, and that we put it last week, is this. Emotionally healthy mission is we go slow, and we go deep, and we go wide. Do you like how I said that? I was trying to rehearse that as much as possible. But can I hear you say slow, deep, and wide? Slow, deep, and wide. That's right. That hopefully we're a people then, that emotional health matters. Beneath the surface discipleship matters, as does mission. Now, both of those work together. Now, in a place like Manhattan in New York City, we are so driven, though, by progress and by achievement and by up and to the right and the bottom line and return on investment. I mean, this is the town that we live in. It so heavily emphasizes mission, achievement, money, success. Now, keep in mind, like most of us probably moved here because we love that about this city. It's not only that we get to have chocolate chip cookies in the city, we get the best chocolate chip cookies in the world. I mean, come on now, that's what New York is about, isn't it? It's about achievement and growth. Wow, we got a cheer in the second row here as well. I mean, this is who we are as a city. Now, in many ways, the Christian tradition does emphasize this idea of being excellent and doing the best that we can. In fact, check out what the Apostle Paul writes in the book of Philippians. And I mentioned this passage last week. Look at what Paul writes. Paul writes, convinced of this, and the Apostle Paul is one of the earliest followers of Jesus. He's writing this from prison. He says, I know that I will remain, and I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy. Can I hear you say progress and joy? That's right, in the faith, so that through my being with you again, your boasting in Christ Jesus will abound on account of me. Now, what is Paul writing? He's writing to the early church, and he's talking about these two characteristics of what's supposed to mark the church. In other words, there's progress. Yes, we are a people who are moving forward. We're advancing. But there's also joy. There's a texture to the way that we're advancing. Now, I talked last week about how there's progress and joy. Another way of putting it is mission and morale. Can I hear you say mission and morale? That both of these things are important. That being on mission, that advancing is important. But morale is important too. And the reality is, in a city like ours, so much of what's made is mission, advancement, going for it, achieving. And Paul and the Christian witness, though, has not simply only been about that. It's been about morale as well. It's been about the way that we do things. That the way that we do things hopefully has a certain texture of joy, of morale, of love, of kindness. Now, check out the Apostle Peter, who's one of the earliest disciples of Jesus. He's writing to the persecuted church in Asia Minor. And the scripture that was just read for us, look at what Peter is writing when he talks about the way that Christians are to show up in the world. He says, finally, be compassionate and humble. High five your neighbor and say, be compassionate and humble. That's right. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing. Now, how counter is that to the ways of the world, to the ways of our city? It says, for whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil. In other words, be someone with your tongue that you speak the truth, and their lips from deceitful speech. See, it's not only about being compassionate and humble, it's also being truthful and full of integrity with the words that we use. He says, but in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. High five your neighbor and say, gentleness and respect. That's right. Compassionate, gentleness, respect. Notice the tenor of what Peter is propagating. The ways in which we are to be kind and gentle and respectful and truthful, keeping a clear conscience so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. See, the earliest Christians, they understood that a fundamental part of their witness, of their showing up in the world, was not simply about advancing the mission, winning at all costs. but it was also the way that we showed up. We show up with compassion, with gentleness and respect, and with truthfulness, and the way that we show up with character. Now, essentially, here's what Peter is writing. When he's writing about the Christian witness, even being a persecuted minority, here's what he's saying. He's saying character matters. The texture of character really matters. The way that we live in truthfulness really matters. And the way that we live with gentleness and respect for others, even our enemies, really matters. Character matters. Now, I know what you're thinking. Some of you are like, man, I can't believe it. I came to church again to be hit with this morality bomb where you're basically saying, oh my goodness, you need to be better. Character matters. And see, but it's not only Christians that believe this. Even the ancient world, there was this idea that character really matters. Aristotle, in his book, The Art of Rhetoric, persuasion and rhetoric, the ability to persuade people was such a central value, especially in the ancient Greco-Roman world. The reason why was because whether it was a court of law or in different settings, persuasion, oral persuasion was paramount to the ways that you showed up as witnesses or in the court of law. Now, in The Art of Rhetoric, Aristotle, essentially, he talks about three words that make up what's called the rhetorical triangle. It's these three words. It's ethos, pathos, and logos. Now, you don't even need to know Greek to kind of get a sense of what these words might mean. And these three elements are the elements of any persuasive arguments. This is what Aristotle would talk about. Now, here's what logos means. Like, we get words like logic from logos. Logos is basically the logic of one's argument. Like, if you're gonna be a persuasive presenter, then of course what you have to say has to make sense. It has to have logos to it. Now, for us in the West, of course, we say, of course, this is really, really important for us. But then there's also pathos. Now, what is this word pathos? Pathos is a word that we get words like sympathy or empathy from pathos. Pathos is this word for feeling or mood. Now here's essentially, in the rhetorical triangle, it's not only logic, but it's also pathos, the mood. It's for a speaker or someone who's persuading others, you have to understand what everyone else feels and kind of what their zeitgeist or what their beliefs are. You have to know your audience. So in other words, one of the reasons, and this is so easy, you probably noticed this in my preaching, I make a lot of jokes about Staten Island. It's because I know y'all and I know you'll laugh. Some of you from Staten Island are like, no, but it's still funny. Pathos, right? Like pathos is knowing your audience, is knowing what's happening. And then there's ethos. So if there's logos, the logic of one's argument, if there's pathos, knowing your audience, there's ethos. Now, we get words like ethical from ethos. What is this word ethos? It's character. It's credibility. I can be a presenter about all sorts of things, but at the end of the day, if I'm not a credible witness, if I don't have character that gives me the right to stand up here, then my argument, no matter how logical or how much I understand the audience, it really loses its power and effectiveness. Now, at the end of the day, what's essentially being said is that character matters. See, it's not simply Peter who's talking about how character matters. It's also those beyond the church that are talking about how character really matters. Now, there's something fundamental about the virtues that Christian virtue and Christian morality is talking about, but the essence of this is the same, is that character. When it comes to witness and mission, your character matters. My character matters. Now, the reality is, though, so many times character can get overlooked if you can fulfill the bottom line. If you make money for the organization, if you help us advance and go up and to the right, then of course we will basically excuse character and just go for the results, the business results. That's what we're looking for. Now, as someone, I am someone who's very driven, I'm passionate, I'm a workaholic in so many different ways. There's actually this book that I loved. I devoured this book. And perhaps you've read this book before, if you've heard of this book before. And it's this book by a business management guru named Jim Collins. And the book is called Good to Great. And I remember just reading that title and just thinking, I'm gonna get this book. because I just don't want to be good. I want to be great. I'm not from Staten Island. No, I'm sorry. See, there it is. I know the audience. Anyhow, I want good to great. Yeah, this is who we are. Like New York City, this is what we're about. Good to great. And of course, in this book, and I love this book, it's about these business strategies about what greatness really looks like. How to take a company that's not just merely good or mediocre, but actually to have it become great. Now, I am driven by this, and there's no shade at books like this, because the reality is the scriptures also talk about this mission and this verve towards excellence and towards wanting to be the best version of yourself, to do everything for the glory of God. Now, recently, though, another book came out. It's a book by a pastor from Korea named Hyun Lee. And here's the book title. It's called Great to Good. How the way of Jesus actually reshapes our ambitions. How, yes, there is this value of greatness that we're pursuing, of excellence that we're going for. But fundamentally, there's also this way in which it's not greatness and success in the world's eyes that we long for. It's goodness that matches the texture of my character, of your character, of the ways in which we live out what it means to follow Jesus. Now, believe me, there's like the fear of God in me as I preach this message, because I recognize that when it comes to church ministry and perhaps some of the scandals that have befallen even church communities, there's ways in which money, sex, and power, those same things that trip people up in various different industries, have the same potential to trip up the church and me. And so here I am talking about character matters, and the reality is I'm like, oh Lord, help me, God. Because I recognize in me how flawed I can be as well. And yet what Peter is writing about, and what the early church knew about the witness of the church, was that character mattered. The way that we show up in the world. In my own background, Korean American heritage, which was deeply impacted by Confucianism. And Confucianism, a very kind of simplistic way of putting it is, when it comes to the ways in which ethics were worked out in Confucianism, there's this public world, this public arena, in which my public ethic for everyone to see was displayed a certain way. But meanwhile, that was supposed to match a private ethic, the way in which I treated my family, and the way that I held respect and honor within my family. Now, in the best version of Confucianism, both of those things are to meld. But the reality is, in shame-driven cultures, what would often happen is that my public and private life would actually become incredibly different, because the incentive was way more heavily weighted towards, my public life. As long as I could keep a good face in public before everyone, then there was no incentive to have my private life be actually upheld when it comes to character. So as a result, the culture that I grew up in, and especially even the church culture that I grew up in, so much of it was, hey, we're moving, we're growing, we're doing well. Look at how great the church is going. And yet the church that I grew up in, there would be massive church splits, even though our church was one of the largest immigrant churches in Southern California. And I remember one time, there was a fist fight amongst a group of leaders within the church. And I would think to myself, something can't be right about this. Here we are talking about love, and people are fighting. They're about to throw down in the sanctuary. Now, don't get me wrong. As a middle schooler, I thought it was awesome too. It was really, really amazing. People often say, oh, you're a Christian because you grew up in church. I'm like, no. Yeah, listen, I'm a Christian despite growing up in the church. Meanwhile, my father, who ended up becoming a pastor later on in my life, who was very harsh towards my mom and towards the four of us, my brothers and I. Later on, he would become a pastor. And you could imagine, my father ends up becoming a very prominent minister in Korea. And so but meanwhile, most of my teenage and adult years is wrestling through, I don't understand this. Like my dad has a significant platform as a pastor, but yet I've been so wounded by my dad and the relationship of our family. Now, it's only after understanding the reality that it's so easy to have this public persona and this private life. And it's so easy for me before you all to be able to speak these messages and to preach about ethos, pathos, logos, whatever, and yet at the same time be someone that can be so incredibly petulant and unloving towards my spouse. And so this is where the fear of God is in me, because the reality is the scriptures constantly talk about how character matters. It matters how we show up with our truthfulness. It matters the gentleness and respect by which we live. And the reality is, you all in this room, you're young, you're bright, you're talented, you've gone to the best schools, you work in the best industries. The reality is, your ascension in whatever industry is probably up and to the right, and you're ambitious. And at the end of the day, it gets harder and harder for you, for me, for all of us to take seriously this mandate that character truly matters. And the reality is, what good is it if the mission continues and yet your character has somehow been denigrated? And some of us, when it comes to the way we use our words, the truth-telling, some of us, when it comes to money, sex, and power, there are things that are starting to creep in. And the question for me and for you is, will we come correct before God and just say, God, I need you. This matters. See, but it's not only character. Last week we talked about the great commandment. And in the great commandment, notice what's written in the great commandment. In the great commandment, Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. It says, love your neighbor as yourself. High five your neighbor and say, love your neighbor as yourself. That's right. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. Now, notice, it is interesting because this is the great commandment here. It's about loving God with everything, and it's about loving others as you love yourself. Now, notice, Jesus doesn't say, hey, love other people, period. And he doesn't say, love other people as I have loved you. He doesn't say that. He says, love others as you love yourself. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean to love others as you love yourself? I remember I was counseling this one couple, and they were mired in this conflict. And I remember there was this one moment where the wife said to the husband, listen, I don't want you to love me the way you love yourself, because I've seen the way you treat yourself. You are harsh toward yourself. You cuss yourself out all the time. You don't take care of yourself. Please don't love me that way. See, what Jesus is basically saying, that what presupposes loving others or having an ability to love others, it actually comes from first loving yourself. In other words, it's not only character that matters, your well-being matters. Your well-being matters. High five your neighbor and say, your well-being matters. If you've ever been on an airplane, I mean, you've heard these instructions before. The flight attendant will get you ready to be on this plane and will basically say, hey, listen, in the case of an emergency and you need to put your mask on, there's a certain direction that it goes. And there's always this commendation is you need to do steps 1 through 3 as seen on the image before you get to step 4. In other words, you need to put on your own mask before you put the mask on your child or the person traveling next to you. And they're so clear about this, they say this all the time. And the question is, why do they say that? Why? Because you can't save your child if you're dead. I mean, that's as blunt as I can put it. There's no way you can love or rescue anyone if it's not out of a place where you've taken care of yourself, where you've been able to first put on your own mask. Your well-being, your own sense of fullness and wholeness really matters. Some of us, you are driven to the point of exhaustion. You have been go, go, go. You realize that the way that you've treated relationships, you've started to get into these patterns of hurting people and you don't know why. And what if it's because your well-being, you haven't tended to your own well-being, and as a result, you cannot love others well? See, here's the reality. If your character and your well-being are in jeopardy, the mission is in jeopardy. Your family's in jeopardy, your career's in jeopardy. If your character and your well-being are in jeopardy, the mission is in jeopardy. In other words, as goes the person, so goes the mission. Now, here's the way that Jesus put it. What good is it, my friends, if you gain the whole world, but you forfeited your soul? What good is it? What good is it if you're on this upward trajectory, but you realize that you have not tended to your character and to your well-being? And because of that, the mission is in jeopardy. Your life is in jeopardy. Now, I realize this is an incredibly sobering word to be giving in this moment. And some of you are like, whoa, Drew, you're bringing it really hard right now and heavy. Well, here's the beautiful thing about Jesus is that today can be a new day. If there's any inkling within you that if there's any area of your life where your character, there's a sense that something might be in jeopardy because of an addiction or because of an ambition that's gone kind of over the top, or if there's anything in you right now where it comes to your own well-being, your own sense of wholeness and self, and it's beginning to impact your relationships and the people around you, and you realize you're not sure if you can make it another day, here's the good news. Here's what Jesus says. He says, come to me, all of you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. All you have to do is say, that's me, weary and heavy laden. I need the rest of God. Take my yoke, Jesus says. Take my yoke. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. Now, this doesn't mean your life will get better. All of a sudden, all your problems will lift. What it means is, see, when you're under the guidance of the Good Shepherd, when you've come to Jesus as the one who you say, you are my master and Lord, what you're essentially saying is, Jesus, I need you to be the one who guides me. And whatever comes in my life, the hills and valleys of my life, you are the Good Shepherd. Thing is, all you got to do is you just have to raise your hand and be like, Jesus, I'm weary and heavy laden. My character, my well-being, it's heavy right now. And Jesus says, I will give you